credit card, your address. They have a lot of information about your family's behavior on this device. So what happened was, this is how what I'm going to show you is how it kind of comes out when the bad thing has occurred. The bad event has occurred. How does it get out there? So I'm a kind of a tech geek. I like iPads and all that stuff. And so I kind of follow some of these sites. So this was about April 17th or 18th. This is a tweet from Engadget, a tech gadget site. PlayStation Network down for a long count. What's up, Sony? So first evidence was just the PlayStation Network was down. You couldn't shoot people in Japan anymore. All right. So then what happens is the word starts getting out. Ooh, something happened with the Sony PlayStation Network. 100 million people can't play games. So what does this one say? Ooh, PlayStation Network back online after an external intrusion forced the company to take the system down. So apparently they came back up after they had this, whatever this problem is. So what's the next thing? Oh, now it's not Kotaku or Engadget, sites you may not have heard of. Now we're up here with the New York Times. Look what they say. 21.6 million customer accounts in
12,000.
Well, you know, it's big. And a lot of credit cards and debit card numbers. That's not good. And so that's in addition to the 77 million that was the internet login approach. That's in addition to the 77 million that was from the gaming approach. So we're talking about over 100 million consumers whose information has been disclosed. So what's the next thing? Whoops. The law. FBI cybercrime joins 22 states. What do you mean 22 states? The lawyers from 22 states who enforce consumer privacy rights are saying, we got a big one on our hands. Along with the Federal Trade Commission. We're going to talk more about that. And so they're saying, we're going to have to look into this. This is a serious privacy breach. And what are they asking? What's the question that the law is? Did they do what they said they did? Not everything they could. You don't have to do the private. You know, if you don't say you're going to do anything, and you're not in a regulated industry like financial or healthcare, you don't have to do it. There's some constraints on that, but in general, that's a true statement. So did they do what they said they were going to do? That's going to be the crux of that investigation.
Well, don't you think some of that did they do with what would be common sense sort of solution? Like if I'm Sony and I'm not in a regulated industry, wouldn't common sense dictate this? I've got all this information that's private information that I would take some measure. So I mean, I don't know from a legal standpoint.
Yeah, and you can
get a case right on point about what you're asking. And it's actually an FTC case, but I'll explain later.
And there's another piece about Sony that a lot of people don't know, but they just created a new role at Sony 2 weeks ago. It's called Chief Information Security Officer.
No.
They just created it?
They just created it.
That's after this happened.
Nothing
Well,
like
yeah.
that.
Oops.
So the point I'm trying to make is that, excuse me for projecting here, is that this particular breach was actually breached through the cloud.
Right.
So it was actually came in through Amazon. I'm getting into that, so I apologize if you are. But it was used by somebody going out for $1.86, creating an account in the Amazon cloud, and through that they were able to find a social engineer, get somebody's username and password, and came in through Sony and hacked. It was that simple, $1.86.
Wow.
So these are how easy things are.
So $1.86 of investment by the criminals. So look, I want you to know this is the email I received.
What's that?
You figure each of those debit credit cards are worth $10.
You could actually buy an entire identity online right now for under $2, including credit card, name, address, the security code on the back of the card, valid cards for under $2.
But why pay $2 when you can get 100 million for $1.86?
It's a great
But that's also why you look for the big volume numbers, because the price of went down. Because last time I looked, it was like $10, and so the prices are going being driven down in the marketplace.
right, so this is the email I got from Sony. Dear Mr. Hacker, they're not even that nice. Value PlayStation Network. We have discovered that between April 17 and 19, we got hacked. And look what they say. Although we're still investigating the details of this incident, blah, blah, blah. Well, look, April 17th is when they noted it started happening. Look when I got that. What were they doing for 10 days? What do you think they were doing? Talking to their lawyers. And they're expensive lawyers too, let me assure you. So they were scrambling like crazy to figure out how they were going to handle this problem. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Cost to fix the problem, estimated at $2 billion. That's a hit for Sony, even a company as big as Sony. $2 billion. $1.86 of investment causes Sony $2 billion of damages. Sony's in trouble. And guess what? This network's still not up. It's partially back up. But it's still not up. My kids still can't shoot other guys in Japan. They're not happy about it, let me assure you. Their customers are mad.
And they're not making any money right now. That's right. So that's a big thing you have to keep in mind. They're losing not only the money, but they're also having to pay out and breach notifications, which are very expensive.
Andy, wasn't it also the case that some of the things that were breached were things like Mother's name or something as password?
Oh, and they gather a lot of data so that they can help you protect your
Yeah, the
challenge question. So that might mean that users like you would have to go actually change some of your commonly used challenge answers out there in the
their recommendation is go change all that stuff because we don't know what's out there. Okay, next slide. So to bring that down to kind of something you can carry away is it's not just money, right? If this happens, and let's talk about a nonprofit. Where's your greatest risk? If you have your donor information or your constituents' information, your clients' information, and it gets out there, you didn't do it on purpose. Somebody got it out there, or a mistake was made by an employee, but all this information gets disclosed. Well, it hurts your reputation, right? Is that important to nonprofits? Your reputation? It's critical. And it might result in things like loss of income, because if you can't take care of my credit card information, I'm not going to give you money anymore. And you might have to focus some staff time and attention on fixing this problem, so you get loss of productivity by your people. You might have to pay some fines, or you might at least, as an act of goodwill, need to pay for some credit protection for a while for your donors or your constituents. And the government might exact some costs from you, and you might get sued. So, the question becomes, could one privacy breach destroy your organization? You'll have to answer that question. I don't know, but it's not inconceivable. So what do we do? Well, so that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about. What do we do? And I felt it would be good to start by having Tammy talk about what is Home Depot. And this is setting the bar, right? If your annual budget is $50,000, you're not going to do what Tammy does. But this will give you a really good sense. Well, I don't know. Your budget may be $50,000.
When I started, it was.
Good job. But this is you're going to get a sense of what is a big company that has resources, that cares. What do they do? How do they get after this thing? And a lot of what Tammy and her organization are doing, it translates down. Just it's a matter of scale. So,
Thank you. I've been with Home Depot about 2 years, and my background, the last 25 years, has been in banking and insurance. So coming into a retail industry for me was a little bit different, but once I sat at my desk, it's all the same, no matter how big, how small. But protecting any business, depending, if you have 5 employees or 300,000 employees globally, you have to find ways that you can find a way to protect yourself, but it's only really really 3 easy steps of doing it, right? Assessing your risks, making sure you have an information security plan and program in place, and then ongoing monitoring. I mean, it's not that simple, but it is, right? You really need to look at your organizations and say, you know, what's important to me? What do I need to look at? What do I don't need to look at? When I joined Home Depot, my security organization was small. It was not adequate in training in some areas. Privacy was something that was kind of being looked at. We were PCI compliant. We didn't have a program in place, which scared me to death. And I'm like, how do we get this program that can just make sure that we're enforcing our regulations and our security controls to make sure that we were protected? So I created this IT compliance and data privacy program, right? So as I looked through this and I said, well, what do we have? What's the data that we're trying to protect, right? So a lot of that was for us is having to define what our data was. What is restricted? What is confidential? What is, who doesn't care, right? My own stuff, right? Internal communications, right? You don't have to protect those. I'm emailing it to you. You work for me. That's okay, right? Security policy standards and guidelines, and I added to my little handwritten notes, and awareness, right? The program, no matter how small your company is, if you have 1 employee, you need a program, a policy document. These are your rules to use the systems in our environment. This is what you do when you're on the internet. This is what you do when you're sending an email. Here's what you do about protecting the data that you're using every day. Right? You are not going to email credit card numbers home to go work on a project that I asked you to work on because it's not encrypted, it's not covered. You're sending something in the email in the clear. Somebody can interject that, right? So those are things you don't really think about, but from an employee perspective and protecting yourselves and your companies, you want to make sure that those policy and programs are in place. At Home Depot, we had a policy that hadn't been updated in quite some time. We took a huge effort in rewriting our entire policy program and standards. It's a book, but we rewrote them all. What do you do on the internet? What are you allowed to do? What's for business purposes only? How do we protect our records and our data? And all that information got republished this year in January. It took us a lot of months to pull it together. But then we go through a certification process this year where everybody says, did you go out there and look at the policies and programs and certify that you've read them? Second piece is building experience, or third actually, is the IT compliance program. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. But we actually built.
So Tammy, one of the questions I have with this is and you've got employees, but a lot of us as nonprofits have volunteers as well.
Right.
So would you do this for volunteers and employees, and how do you think about those two different kind of workforces and people who have access on your behalf?
That's a great question. What we've done in the past, I've worked for other nonprofits like you spoke about earlier, but what I did was we created for our nonprofits a paper that was basically like an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, is that you use with your contractors and your temporary and your volunteers to make sure that the information that they're working on in your organizations is kept private. It protects you, and it also protects them for coming in and volunteering. So I always recommend, no matter how small, how big, you have some kind of non-disclosure agreement in place. And part of that is your security, just your security blurb, right? You will keep all of Goodwill's information private. You will not share it with anybody. You will not sell it. You will not do this. And these folks can help you with creating that form. But but you know exactly what I'm saying. It's a very simplistic form, but it's something that will protect you and your companies. Did I answer your question okay?
Yes, thank you very much.
All right, great. Our IT compliance security team is made up of a handful of people. That's it in this organization. However, I'll show you later how big the compliance program is. Even though I just have a few people actually on the compliance team, it is a partnership across the organization in order to make it work. The biggest and hardest part is mapping your current security controls to regulatory requirements. What does that mean, right? What is that? Right? We have so many controls, and you look at the SOX controls and state regulatory controls and PCI, and we look at our security controls. What is that word? What is security controls? Right? I go to a website called SANS.org. It's SANS.org. And stands doesn't stand for anything, really. But it's a security organization, and they have such great templates out there for you to use. It has policy information, it has white papers, it has a lot of stuff that's free. That's a great word. But it also allows you to look at some of the regulatory requirements around security controls. I map our security controls around what they call CSCs, and these security controls actually help you look at things that are important to you and judge what's important, right? So if you don't have wireless in your environment, that security control, who cares, right? But if you're housing a lot of data, there might be different encryption things, data that you need to protect, and those are the controls that you need to look to and map to your regulatory. They'll talk more about the regulations and go through all of those with you guys a little bit later. But with all of the people we touch and being a global company, we really had to take this up a notch, right? Once again, setting that bar, right? Security, we talked a little bit earlier about behind the curtain, but that's truly what it is. Security needs to be behind the curtain, but it's like the Wizard of Oz thing, right? You have to have this big head coming out saying, you will get the broom, right? Well, or not, we'll just sweep you out, right? So those are the things that, there's no guts, no glory until a breach happens, and then they're like, well, why didn't you do this? And you have to have that program say, but we did. But, there's hackers will find a way in. That's the problem. The way to find what we needed to do and what we don't need to do is that gap analysis piece, right? So what is your ideal state, right? Where do you want to be? What do you want to protect? What data do you have, right? It's not that hard if you're not collecting credit card information, but there's state privacy laws, like in Massachusetts, that has been a crazy one for us to try to map to, is they consider 2 pieces of any information now as private. So if you do any business with somebody in Massachusetts, even if you're in Atlanta, they come over and buy something from you, and they're from Massachusetts, and you lose their name and driver's license number, you have to do a breach notification. There's all kinds of craziness in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has one of the most strictest, it's what we call PCI on steroids here. That's what my team calls it, because there's a lot of laws around it, and there's multiple state laws across the country that require you to control their information a little bit differently. The ongoing focus to enhance and enforce security controls is something that if you don't do it in your organization, whether you're 2 people, 500, 300,000, is that you're going to find yourself getting into this repeatable process of forgetting to do things. We used to do this a lot here. Is it always ideal? No. But it's making sure we do the right thing, but also doing the right thing right. One of our values says, do the right thing. When I walked in my first day, they have these big orange signs. I'm sure you guys saw them walking through maybe the entryway. One of them said, do the right thing, and it bugged me all the way through the hallway. And I'm like, do the right thing? Well, we all do the right thing, but do we do it right? And if we don't do it right, it doesn't matter, right? So I had a lot of employees that were doing the right thing, but were we doing them right? I had a lot of business partners that were doing the right thing for their business, right? Selling hammers. We need to sell more hammers. But were we selling the hammers right? The pin pads that people come in and swipe their credit cards through. I don't know, are you guys talking about Michael's at all? Michael's is a store, right, that people go to. I'm sure you've probably seen that in the news. They had, in 80 stores, 90 of those little pin pads, which were not PCI compliant, were swiped out by people that were impersonating repairmen. So they came in, they took that PCI, and they put one in their place. They sat in the parking lot and got everybody's credit card information. This was just over the last 2 weeks. And so Michael's knew that their pin pads weren't PCI compliant. Visa had already told them that they weren't. Guess what they just did? They just replaced 7,200 pin pads in their organization over the last week because they didn't make the investment. They weren't even locked down. You can just unhook them and put a new one in there, right? Which is awesome, right? It's like, this is great, you know? But like the ones that we have in our stores, if you take them, they have platters inside, if you take them out of the store, they're done, right? So the data's destroyed. Once again, it's that simple. It's that scary.
Invisible ink.
Invisible
So it's on you.
It's like, you walk through and you hello, and hey, Michael's the bank wrapper. That's it. But the last, partner, I mean it. It's not just partner. Go ahead, I'm sorry. I was just talking about partnering internally, partner with your business, partner with your business partners. Talk to people that you work with every day. Talk with people that come into your store or you do business with, and ask them what their concerns are. Right? What data is important?
How do we control if we're contracting out? I mean, even the company that came in and got the little boxes off of Michael's, that's probably a company they contracted out with. So how do you keep controls over the companies that you contract with? Is the technology company that we're contracting with to do this huge platform, it's going to be more about what they have in control, security in place, and then how do we protect ourselves against things that they may not protect themselves against?
Yes.
Great question.
Well, hire good lawyers. No.
Actually, one of the things that a lot of the things that we do is when we have a lot of our small nonprofits will set up a new website, or they'll update their website, or they'll change their platform. And we said one of the things that the lawyers that work with them do, and I am not an IT lawyer, I will preface that, I'm a tax exempt attorney, is what is your contract? Who owns your website? Who has control over it? What do their privacy requirements say? So that you understand when, and Andy's done these projects, what is it that you are, so that you understand the background of who you're working with and what your requirements are then on your website to address that. That doesn't necessarily go to the level that you're talking about, but it's the same concept, and you really do have to understand who you're working with and what the agreement is.
But you may have 4 or 5 people, and one of them may be, if you're thinking PlayStation doesn't have a you, and when I question the bank about their practices, they look at me like I have, 3 eyes in my head, and I'm like.
But it's your right. It's your right to know what privacy they have in place. Over the last 18 months, working closely with our communication partners and our legal partners within Home Depot, we've created new documents, new contracts. We've added to all of our service agreements and master service agreements with corporations to ensure that we have security clauses and breach notification clauses built into our contracts now. So although we will still have a brand hit, right, if something should happen, however, from a legal standpoint, we hold them financially responsible for the breach, but like I said, we still have to do the smoke and mirror stuff on the other side, because we still have to go through the process of making sure that we're following the right steps.
But you won't have the $2 billion hit.
That's correct. And if there's an insurance clause to that, and I'll tell you, I'll get your question for 1 second. But when we actually do our contracts, we actually have an insurance clause added in for that. We require them to carry insurance to cover for breach. Go ahead, please.
One of the things I was going to say is, so wouldn't doing this before you actually go and invest in your IT partner and having a clear cut, this is what we need or require from a security point of view, and using that as part of your RFP or your RFQ as part of with whoever you're doing your IT with, building that into the contract itself and saying, this is what we're requiring, or the level of, and working with the,
If you know that. If you know it, it's great. But also, a lot of IT partners and a lot of support organizations have the ability to kind of walk you through some of this, through templates and formats, and partner with you to help you identify and do some of this work as well. So, it's always good up front to make sure you engage, engage an attorney or some kind of legal counsel. It's always great to make sure that you're understanding the security requirements of your group and what you collect. And then when you're doing a request for quotes, a request for proposal for work in your organizations, I think it's very important to make sure that you do know the data. So some of the stuff of defining and assigning and making sure you have some of your basic security policies and what's important to you in place is always important to have in hand.
And on the contracts and volunteers thing, a lot of, and this is something Goodwill learned, one of the first things you need to engage is your insurance carrier when you're talking to them about engaging contractors and volunteers or anyone that's actually going to deal with your property or with people in your organization, because sometimes your insurance carrier will actually not allow you to do that. You can actually be in breach of your insurance, and if you're not aware of that, because we can no longer use volunteers.
Let me add to one thing with regard to your question. Often when you hire these people, they'll give you a contract. They say this is our form agreement, and interestingly, in that agreement, it won't say who has the ball about the security issues. You need to nail down. You
Yeah, I was getting ready to say what he said. I know at Comcast, we have measures that are in place that if you tell us exactly what you want to do, we're required by the federal government to make sure that that information is not touched. And I'm sure Verizon has the same policy and procedure, because if it is, we're allowed for that. And we can add addendums to that, as Tammy said, to that contract to say if something happens, we're liable for it too as well. So if you did know that, when you're talking to a provider, just make sure it's mandatory that you put that in part of the agreement. Say, hey, this is what I need, this is what I'm requiring. And if a company is worth anything, they will have those in place about something.
Does it fall under general liability policy, or is it some other kind of policy?
That's a kind of a complicated thing. The general liability policies don't necessarily cover all of the kind of risks we're talking about.
There's actually a new type of policy coming out, which is called the online breach policy. It's just about these laws. I think that the market will the world's still out on that, whether that's really worth the money you're paying. But then there's also a specialized type of insurance beyond your GL, which is it's electronic, online errors and omissions. So it's a special type of insurance.
It's an important, the insurance piece is important for you because, so let's say you sign, you have your volunteer sign a form that says, we won't do bad things with the data. And they breach it. Maybe it's an accident. They accidentally do it. Are you going to sue your volunteers? You better have a backup strategy for how you're going to get your work done if you start suing your volunteers. So insurance is an important piece of this. And it's one that's a pragmatic risk measure. But you need to talk with your broker carefully about what covers the issues.
And Tim's point, are they under your policy? Can your volunteer be even under your policy? That's Tim's point.
Those are things that is possible. There are a lot of nonprofit corporation-specific brokers out there. So if you're just using a standard broker, there are brokers out there that work with nonprofits and understand some of the different policies that are available in the nonprofit realm. A lot of our clients have coverage for their volunteers. That's correct. Any more questions?
One of the things is I'm listening to what the possibilities are and what things we could do, and it's sort of in my role as CEO, I'm always kind of wondering what's the cost benefit and how do I sort through this, because because I could go, there's all kinds of things that you can do and they make like perfect sense,
Right.
but then there's sort of the affordability, there's how many of these things can I really address, who's going to pay attention to it, so
We call that risk assessment.
yeah, and so, are there any kind of pointers, and to me it's sort of judgment about what things are there, and, how do I begin to even think about the risk assessment that you can
When you
give
do
us?
risk assessments or risk modeling is kind of what you're referring to. The methodology that I use is the average likelihood of an event to occur. Right, so you have a particular event. I'm going to do this very short, quick. You have a specific item in your organization that's a risk, right? The likelihood of them stealing name and driver's license number. The likelihood of them stealing that, how many times in a year? 0.25, maybe, right? Has it ever happened before? Well, no. Well, how did you get to 0.25? All right, well, maybe not. Maybe 1 in every 4 years I have a chance of that happening. If it happens, how much is it going to cost you? Right? And then you look at the average likelihood of an event to occur. How much is it going to cost you if that event occurs? And if it's going to cost you $2 million to fix it, and the event's going to cost you $40,000 if it happens, then don't focus your money there. All right? But if the average likelihood of an event to occur once a year, and it can cost your company millions of dollars, and it's going to cost you $10,000 to fix it, Home Depot will fix it. Right? It's all based on average likelihood of an event to occur. And that's how you measure out that risk, right? It's also around the security controls again, right? If you have controls in place that will protect that data, then those are the areas you can leave behind the curtain, right? The grand old Wizard of Oz, leave it within, right? But when you have the other stuff that's kind of hanging out there, you've got to watch out for the buckets of water. And that's where you guys will get hit.
One other comment to that is you pointed out having checklists.
Yes.
And I think that a lot of our nonprofits use, instead of dollar resources, people resources.
Right.
Having checklists is so important. Our website was hacked on Christmas of 2009. We did not know that we had Joomla that had access, and if you didn't update it on a regular basis, that they would come back in and redo it. And 6 months later, after we got it all cleaned up and paid a bunch of money, it turned back into the Asian Liberation Front. So it took us a year to get our website fixed. And we were in the process of trying to put all kinds of wonderful resources for our clients on that website, which are now available. But we learned a lot, and that is that we have a ticker now that every 2 months we update our Joomla to the latest version, because if you keep it updated, it solves the problem. My point is that that's one of those little checklist items that when you can do those sorts of things, it doesn't cost anything, but it saves you a lot.
Key things, especially around your infrastructure. That's a piece that we're really not going to talk about today, but your servers, your desktops, your computers, antivirus, endpoint protection, servers, patched. Wait, did I say patched? Patched. And make sure your patches are done every month on your systems.
And if you don't know what she's talking about, hire TechBridge.
Yeah. I mean, and that's an important piece. People don't understand the importance of patching your systems and having security controls on your systems. They're not expensive things to do, but they're important activities that need to be done. It's not easy to automate a lot of it, but it is something that TechBridge or folks like TechBridge can help.
So the Joomla that she was referring to is an open source technology to do websites. So what she's really saying is that these technologies that support your websites is just one example, because a website is a main portal for all of our organizations. So here it's open source, so it means it's free. You pay somebody or use a volunteer to create the website for you. But there's always, one of the things that we like to say is there's sort of the monster in the basement, is that technology has to be cared and fed for, and putting patches on are one of the most important things, just like when your virus scan and updating your viruses and things like that. So just so everyone understands where that vulnerability was, it was that simple.
And we're actually very blessed, because all of our other data, other than our website, is housed in the Sutherland Law Firm, that provides us with free space and free services. So we have our own IT department that handles all that. Just our website was out there, and it took so much time and energy. That's all I can say.
Well, I'm not going to go through this, but this is just a sample of our data classification matrix. Defines our data out, restricted, confidential, internal use, public information. This is part of the documentation we did. And it kind of lays out what type of description, whether it's email, LAN, voicemail, etc., and if it's restricted, the different requirements each one of our groups are supposed to follow regarding all that. This is our IT compliance program, and I'm going to just I'm not going to talk through it too much, but we have a steering committee, and our steering committee really is the oversight to our compliance program. It's made up of VPs of several areas. We have an advisory committee, which is made up of our lawyers, internal audit, and finance areas. We have an operating committee that's really doing the day-to-day to ensure that our regulations are being followed. And then we have a project leadership team that follow different work streams to make sure that the work that we say we're getting done is getting done. Really, it's just the working groups, then we have the requirements, we have remediation activities, which go around chain of custody, those types of things. Sustainability is really compliance, training, awareness, policy program. And those are things that we check through. We meet monthly from an operating committee, steering committee quarterly. Project teams meet weekly. Kind of wrapping up, go to the next slide. Just some key things to remember is prevention, solution, policies, procedures need to be identified, they need to be in place. Resolution is in the event of a security breach, make sure you have plans and procedures in place so you know what to do. We do tabletop exercises here. We had a breach. We don't tell anybody. We make believe it's real. And people panic for a day, but we got it down to an art now where we know exactly what to do from public relations to legal. And restitution. The other part is that you need to know what the repercussions of a security threat to your company is, right? So you need to make sure that you ensure any loss or trust or business is minimal and as short-lived as possible. They're like sewing wood, right? And turn into a lot of eggs. With that, I know we asked a lot of questions. I think I've overstayed my welcome up here. But I'm very proud of our team. They've come such a long way. Security is not a glamour job. We talked a little bit earlier. Security officers will always be a meets, never be an exceeds. and when something happens, we're do nothings. So, it's no glamour, but we work hard, and I think that getting the help that you need for your organization is going to be really critical. Make sure you keep it up to date.
And when you're a lawyer, they already have 2 strikes against them.
And lawyer, yeah, go figure. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, how many more minutes do you have to do? Half an hour or is it an hour?
Till 11.
Oh, great, all right. So, hey guys, what I'm up here to do is to talk to you about what the state of the law is right now. And I thought, I'm not going to go into really great depth here because I think we don't have time to do that, but the thing to do is to note down the things that may be applicable to the organization to come back, revisit later at greater length when you have a shot, when you have time to do that. The current state of the law, the United States is actually the only major industrialized country that doesn't have a comprehensive privacy regime that's applicable to all the companies across the board with regard to what data they can collect and what their disclosures have to be about the data. Instead, the United States has generally gone with a market-based approach. And like Andy alluded to earlier, that basically means that a lot of companies who aren't in these regulated industries or areas of particular focus of regulation are out there deciding, do I write a privacy policy, do I say something or not? And the market base is actually, they're reacting both to the competitors and to what their customers are expecting. So as you can see, most companies, you go to a hotel, you go to a gym, they have privacy policies. This is actually working. There's a lot of privacy policies out there just because it's a consumer expectation at this time that they're particularly with evolving technologies, there's a lot of confusion. This is happening right now in the EU. There's a mess about cookies right now. That you actually have to have consent before you lay a cookie on somebody's computer in the EU. And people are all running around saying, how do we do this? They're going to have different interpretations. Law firms are often out there putting out, their interpretations. And the good part is, as long as you have kind of a good faith interpretation for your group, and if the regulators come calling and you have a good faith interpretation, then you're already a lot better off than someone who just has, ostrich approach. No, it's not. What I wanted to communicate to you guys, though, is that this look of the privacy laws right now is basically kind of an ocean of not a lot of regulation that's enforced by the FTC. We'll start that in a couple of slides later. But this ocean of little pockets or islands of regulation. So you see there's industry-specific regulations with the government. Those are a lot of governmental organizations are not government entities, that is to say, government authorities are regulated in this sense. Financial institutions and healthcare. You guys all know about, you've heard of Bramley-Wiley, you've heard of HIPAA. These are mostly on the large organizations like banks and healthcare companies. Then there's activity-specific regulatory regimes. We've been talking about PCI compliance. That applies to credit card data, so if you have credit card data. If you have children online, there's a statute that applies there. California is a very interesting thing. If you do business in California, there's a whole lot of regulations that come into force because California is a very unusual place, and we've mentioned Massachusetts too. We'll get into that. Social security numbers. If you find yourself collecting those, there's specific regulations on those in the states.
Let me ask one question. Has anybody encountered security requirements or privacy requirements coming through the grant process? Is that happening yet? No? Don't be surprised. Well, I think it probably is in the federal grant process, and they're just not making a big deal out of it right now.
Well, as Andy alluded, right now there's no duty on a regular company to go ahead and disclose what they're doing with regard to data, what data they're collecting, what they're doing with the data. But once they do say something, once they do offer the public a statement of what they do, the FTC has authority under the Federal Trade Commission Act to make sure that you're honest and you're doing what you're saying you're going to do. They do this under the auspices of the Federal Trade Commission Act, which regulates unfair and deceptive trade practices. Now, a lot of people think about that as like those folks who go after, they offer old ladies prizes and they didn't really win anything. In fact, they have to go through, they pay money and go through obligations. Those are the usual unfair trade practices. But the FTC also has a whole lot of privacy cases out there that they've prosecuted. We'll go into a few of those. The FTC has a lot of arrows in its quiver. If they want, they can impose sanctions up to $10,000 per violation. And each violation is considered a person's whose data was compromised, so it can be a pretty penny. Fortunately, it's a lot less common that they do that. They usually enter into consent orders, so that mandating the company that who had a breach behave in the future and comply with 1, 2, 3, all these little points. A lot of you may wonder if the FTC statute covers nonprofits. There was a Supreme Court decision back in 1979 that said that yes, it can. FTC jurisdiction can touch on nonprofits if a substantial part of the activities of the nonprofit provide pecuniary benefit for its members. So a lot of the way we think about that is if you've got commercial activities out there, then those especially are areas that could be looked at by the FTC and also by states. There's kind of a little mini FTC act in each of the states. So that if you're really local charity and you can't be considered nationwide, where the FTC might be interested, even the state authority might get interested in what you're doing if it's looked at as unfair and deceptive. Anything to add on that? Next. What are some of the cases that have been brought in the past? Some of them are the ones that made really big waves, and I wanted to bring those up. ToySmart was one of the first important cases. ToySmart was running around with a privacy policy that said, we won't sell or share your data with third parties. Then ToySmart went bankrupt and they tried to sell their customer list as an independent asset. And the FTC came marching in and said, no, you can't do that. In fact, what you have to do is give notice to each of those customers, and only if they say yes can you sell their data. So you can imagine how many people want to say, oh yeah, sure, you can. It's not going to happen. That's going to come out very much.
Question. I feel like I get updates all the time to privacy policy saying, oh, by the way, now we're going to start doing that.
Right. So how that
So
works?
it tends to be more of an opt-out.
Well, yes, right. Usually it depends on sort of the extent to which they're changing their policy. If they're going to do something that's a really big derivation from what they've done in the past, the highest standard is the opt-in. But a lot of the companies are afraid that if they go for the opt-in, they're going to lose all the people's data, right? So they're basically taking a little risk there. And they're saying, all right, opt-out, we're going to argue that we didn't give them a chance. They got notice and they got a consent chance. They didn't do anything, so we're keeping their data.
But ToySmart didn't get that option to be able to say, we're going to change policy and just let them know we're changing it.
They didn't. And there's a couple of cases out there. The Sears one, I'll talk about that one too, that is sort of, the FTC likes to come in with an opt-in standard. It's just that, in a way, we're kind of inured as consumers. Things go on and, there's a risk out there that the worst will happen and the FTC will come on to us and say, oh, we have to do this in an opt-in manner. And I think what's happened is the companies have such a risk calculus. I just went through this with one of my clients. They said, there's no way I'm going to do an opt-in. I'll lose all my customer data that none of them are going to say yes. So we're going to just take the chance. We're going to go with an opt-out. We're going to give them lots of notice, big old time frame to opt out, and we're going to say, we think we did a good job on the consent and notice.
But you're hitting a good point. I mean, like the banks, their way of opting out, they don't make it easy, right? You got to write them or call a phone number or whatever.
That's very true.
They don't make it easy. They're doing that for a reason.
That's why I love these.
Yeah.
No, Dee's very right. It's very strict. And the banking industry, from just my background, is that it is that. It's amazing. And they do it on purpose. And then I think a lot of it is just so, it's just the administrative nightmare overhead.
It doesn't seem to be just banks, but anybody that issues a credit in any sense.
That's
Yeah,
right.
Financial.
Financial.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a creditor right there. They would do it right.
And a lot of things that people don't realize is that, like, even like a Citibank, even with Epsilon, to take a step back, even when they lost information, they house Epsilon houses a lot of companies' email addresses. And Citibank holds a lot of credit
This crowd has gotten a little bit louder. It's just hard to hear.
That is. I hear your problem now. Okay. Is that better? Yes?
So can you sort of think about, I'm sitting here going, you know, if I'm a nonprofit and I'm working with folks who don't have jobs and children and data and that kind of thing.
Right.
Can you kind of talk about, because these are sort of kind of retail, you would talk, you know, credit cards and some of that kind of stuff. How do we need to think about that with, you know, I mean, we think about financial literacy, people able to read, not able to read, you know, access to the internet, children, you know, sort of the populate, you know, children being volunteers, goodwill, finding, you know, finding them jobs and things like that. How do you, from your standpoint, think that this really relates to those kinds of transactions and that kind of business?
Okay. Well, obviously the law itself doesn't speak to any kind of difference in populations, but the law it also it does contemplate that some kinds of data are more sensitive than other kinds of data. So you have to look at that spectrum of types of data that you have and figure out for yourself which ones you think are the most sensitive kinds of data, even if you don't have a social security number. If you have health data, you know, like about brain injuries, and you're keeping that to be, you know, the extent of a brain injury in your organization, that's probably a bigger, more sensitive than somebody's address. So I would just devote my time in thinking about how to comply with these laws on the most sensitive types of data. You guys have anything to add to that?
That's another piece of it is, even though we're looking from a regulatory perspective, I talk loud, so I'm sure people can hear me. From a regulatory perspective, what we always recommend is don't go always towards specific regulation, but protect the data for the sake of protecting data, because a new regulation will come in tomorrow, and then you're going to have to repeat the work over and over and over again. So I would say, like I said, about doing the right things right, look at the data that's critical. 2 pieces of PII, personally identifiable information, that you need to keep protected. And make that listed right out. You have name, driver's license, name, account number, name, date of birth, social security number, name, account number, and PIN number, or whatever. Any 2 pieces of PII data is something at a very high perspective that you should worry about from a program perspective. And I know that you can't always do that. If you have to look at specific areas, that's fine to focus on. But I would say look at the data privacy across the whole spectrum, so you're not always trying to recreate that checklist. So that's just my 2 cents.
Let me also say that in terms of regulatory actions, I've never seen the FTC or any of these state authorities come after a nonprofit that was just keeping their head down and trying to do their job, okay?
That's correct.
So one thing that you might want to think about is you probably won't actually encounter a huge regulatory action unless you do something that kind of shocks the conscience, you know? So you got to look at your data and say, well, if this got out or X, Y, and Z happened, people would pretty much be really shocked. So those are the places you would put your efforts.
I think some of the biggest areas are going to be if you work with children, if you deal with anything related to HIPAA, and your donors. If you've got significant donors or grantors and they feel like you've done the wrong thing, trust me, they will go after you in a heartbeat. And if you have sold your mailing list and you promised them you wouldn't, and you've got a big donor, they're not going to let that sit there because they're going to be affronted personally. And so it's that whole slide, the first slide that talked about reputation. It's all about your reputation as a nonprofit. So the FTC may not come after you, but there's other places that will. And so those are really the critical things.
You don't want to be in the newspaper.
Yeah, you don't want to be in the
newspaper.
You know, just, yeah, there have been recently actually in the AJC a couple of instances where there was electronic information that was sent out, some emails that were sent out that were inappropriate and it caused really bad press. And it's not necessarily the level of this issue, but those are the kinds of things that you really need to be careful of with your mailing list, which is probably your biggest issue in terms of what they're talking about here. And then protecting any children information and any health information.
Well, there's actually more. In the BJ's wholesale case, it's a pretty important one for this discussion. What happened there, BJ's didn't even have a privacy policy. They had said nothing, and they were taking credit card information. They stored it in an unsecure manner. They didn't encrypt it. Someone hacked in, got a bunch of credit cards. The the FTC came in and they had an enforcement action saying basically that you have an implied statement that you're keeping credit card information in, at least with industry standard measures applied to it. So it's basically unfair if you take credit card information and don't keep it secure. You could extend that to any kind of sensitive information, and that's where I was going with my sensitive spectrum. Go ahead.
Do you see more violations with larger companies or smaller companies, or equal? Do the smaller companies plead ignorance and the larger companies, you know, kind of try to
What we see, it's a mixture of large and small. The large companies, usually it's something like Sony, where it's just something that they haven't got their house in order. And the smaller companies, often it's like bad actors. You'll see some really, you can tell that there's some sort of unseemly things going on at some of the smaller companies that wind up in the FTC's, sites.
I think that's right. And I also think that there's a bad behavior, but there's also just negligence up and down the spectrum. And it's not, often it's not, when I say negligence, I mean, people aren't doing the basic things that ought to be done. And I mean, some of what Kim's saying and we're saying is, use your common sense. You know what information you have in your organization that's sensitive.
Here's another one, the Lilly case. Lilly had the people who were taking one of the depression drugs, and someone didn't have their thinking cap on, and they addressed an email, and basically they put in the to line everyone's email address who was sort of people who are taking that medication. So FTC came right along, and you just use the BCC, folks. We all know this, right? To put everybody's name and address in the to line.
It's going to be on banking, large bank, small bank?
It's about equal, but to be quite honest is that the larger the bank and the larger the breach, the more public it gets. So there's a lot of small things happen all the time. I belong to InfraGard, which is part of the FBI, and InfraGard is kind of interesting because we get some insider information that I was going to share, but it's a great opportunity for me to be able to leverage some of those metrics. And you'd be surprised how many very small companies find themselves in a lot of hot water. And it's not because they're not doing the right thing, right? It's not doing the right things right. You're thinking of that common sense piece, right? Like I said, in the two field, because we did talk about that in a recent meeting, not that particular Lilly, but about another company that's not the same thing. And so it's really just thinking. It's being smart, but also leveraging volunteers and companies that can help you. Don't try to think you can do it all yourself, because you might think you can, the books can help you all you want, but you really need people that live some of this sometimes to actually be able to kind of walk you through.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good add-on. I'll go really quickly through the whole Sears case. I think that the takeaway from the Sears case, it goes back to what I was saying, watch out for things that are just completely counter to your people's expectations. And what Sears had is a little online community called My Sears, and you downloaded some software, and there was one of those long terms and conditions, nobody ever reads them.
I accept.
Yeah, I accept. So in there somewhere was a disclosure that said that we'll be doing some tracking. And there's some debate about whether it was really a good disclosure about what they were actually doing, but there was a disclosure and there was a consent. I consent to this. What they were actually doing is they were loading spyware on a person's system that was going to spy on them at every website that they ever visited, and send the data that they're inputting at that website to a marketing.
Sears.
Sears. Yes.
It was a tracking cookie, and it really wasn't supposed to the way it was configured. It was not supposed to collect every snapshot that they did, but the way it was configured, it did. Once again, that's an internal control and vulnerability thing that you need to make sure you're doing.
But it wasn't accidental. I mean, they said they were going to do it in their
well,
they were going to track. They were going to do some tracking. So I think one of the takeaway though is if it were just some tracking, would it be all right just to consent to that in the middle of this long terms and conditions? FTC said we actually want you to pop that up. If you're really going to do that, we want you to have an opt-in box right at the front saying that that's what you're going to do. And I think what we take away from this is, again, if it's going to be really counter to your people's expectations, your customer, your donor base, or whoever it is data you have, then think hard about letting them know in terms of what you're about to do with their data.
I have a question. A lot of our clients have these privacy policies at the bottom of their website, you click on it to find out about
Sure.
it. In a situation like that, I mean, not that specific, but if you're gonna do certain things that you said, what you just described, that are different from what their expectations are, should it be beyond that privacy policy? Should nonprofits be thinking about having that sort of opt-in box and so on?
Right now, I mean, I think you're gonna weigh that with the downside of having an opt-in box, because you'll probably find you're gonna have less people who are gonna opt in. Most of the industries right now are playing the opt-out game. And even if, and they're probably adhering to just what the laws expect, mostly on the spam front. For instance, if you collect email addresses, usually they're not gonna, you don't have to ask the person, do you want in or out right now? It's just the person will receive their first email, and if they want, they can opt out at that time. Most people are playing that game because they can for now. We'll see what happens with the future legislation.
I've got a comment on that. One of the things that I've been sort of playing around with with the opt-in and things like that is, and particularly in the technology space, is in some of these opt-in, names on lists and eyeballs generate revenue for for-profit companies. So if we're running a for-profit company, then we want eyeballs, we want customers, we want to have lists, we want to do emails, because we know a friend of mine is in the direct marketing business, and she knows from a fact exactly what percent is going to come back if she sends out so many emails and all those kinds of things, and that's the way that business gets transacted. So to have an opt-out or an opt-in really impacts sort of what their financial model is in terms of how that whole thing works. What I would consider is, we being nonprofits, is whether or not that business strategy really works for us. So, that one of the ways that I think about what we do at TechBridge is we go deep with our clients, and we really want information, and we want to work with the people who work with us. So we're not really in necessarily the business of generating big customer lists. We might be in the business of generating some big donor lists in terms of how that sort of thing works. But I think some of these principles that have gone on and that's one of the things we think about all the time. What is a principle that's working in the for-profit business in terms of how this stuff works because of the way the business models work, and what is it that relates to what's going on? So, and one of the things of it is that one of the things that we're seeing in some of the technology spaces is that, particularly for children, a lot of people want access to kiddos for the technology, whether it's games, whether it's gadgets, whether it's phones, whether it's tablets, whether it's Kindles, all of those kinds of things. So I would consider it and be able to say, if you're working with that, know that it's a market for somebody, that they want access, but for us, it's really some work that we really want to do, and so maybe we want to take a different tact on it, and maybe that tact is really okay if we really want them to opt in.
Mm-hmm. And let me say that if you do take that tack and you work closely with the people whose data you're getting, and you do get an opt-in, you're going to be a lot better protected down the pipe when we get the new laws that are certain are coming, and you'll find yourself, your house is already in order, whereas a lot of people are being out there, they're going to be reactive instead of already. Go ahead.
Sorry. Verizon Business puts out a data breach investigative report every year. We just came out with the 2011 report. And this is a free report on the website where we teamed up with the U.S. Secret Service and the Dutch High-Tech Cybercrime Unit. And we analyzed like 900 million breaches. So there's some findings in that about where these breaches are coming from and what steps to take, how to remediate. So I'm just offering that as a suggestion for information resources. It's verizonbusiness.com. That's a lot of things we should investigate.
Great document. I use it. I read it front to back every year.
Thank you.
It's an amazing document. It's great information.
The data breach investigation report, DBIR. The 2011 was just released. Have you done more of it?
Yes. But it's a very, very good document. We utilize it in a lot of our security roundtables. We use it in a lot of our meetings that we host, and also our cybersecurity czar, the government, Howard Schmidt. He actually reads it. We talk about it. We talk about it every year. So it's a document that gets looked at and talked about up and down.
We definitely wanted to move the program along so that we can talk about, privacy policy, so I'm just going to kind of hop through the acts that apply. The Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, it actually only applies in an online environment, so it does not apply if you're collecting offline data with respect to children. But I would also caution you, you would want to treat data that's collected in an offline manner about children as sensitive data. You can imagine a regime coming down the pike where, you know, you wouldn't want to track that data with a loosey-goosey manner. So although it's not under this statute, you need to be careful with that. This one doesn't apply to nonprofits, by the way, even if you are collecting online. And it's written in the statute that way, so wish my clients could say the same. Can-Spam Act, this actually does apply to nonprofits. They clarified that in 2009. It only applies to messages that are commercial in nature. So if your message is just one that says, you know, please give to our campaign, if that's the entirety of your message, you don't have to worry about this. But if there's a, you know, if you also say, and buy one of our T-shirts, most companies are going to go ahead and, you know, chin the bar of the Can-Spam Act. It's pretty light. You have to use an accurate subject line, identify the sender, give a mailing address, and an electronic means to opt out. You have to honor all opt-outs within 10 days of the request.
That's your unsubscribe button on Constant Contact.
Oh, yeah.
So with this one, you know, there are a lot of people who are saying, if you buy through me, and you tell people if you buy through me that I'm going to give you a % of the purchase.
Okay.
And this is done on, you know,